Hi everyone, welcome back. Last week, we briefly looked at communications in the pre-electronic era and the earliest uses of electricity to send messages via telegraph, telephone, and wireless. We open today with a look at the first nation to understand the power of modern mass market communications, the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. Russia holds the largest territory on Earth, stretching from Europe to the Pacific, but most of its population is located in the western third west of the Ural Mountains. For most of its history, Russia was essentially landlocked, no harbor that was open to the sea all year round. The weather was hot in summer, brutally cold in winter. Agriculture was subsistence, and life was survivalistic. The Romanovs were the great Russian dynasty, established in 1603. By the end of that century, Peter the Great was the Tsar, which is the Russian title for emperor. Peter was a great reformer, although he was an autocrat. He turned Russia's face to the west, made men shave their long beards, and developed the city of St. Petersburg into a port on the Baltic Sea. He was a dictator, but he was a reformer of sorts too. And at 6'8", he was great in more ways than one. Catherine the Great was another accomplished ruler trying to get such a large country with a disparate population under control. Most of the population was rural, agricultural, and these peasants were legally tied to the landlord in a form of bondage called serfdom. 1/3 of the population were serfs. Compounding the problem of modernizing and administering such a large and unwieldy country, the population was composed of dozens of different ethnic and religious groups. Russians, Ukrainians, Turks, Armenians, Kazakhs, Chechens, Georgians, Germans, Uzbeks, Poles, Lithuanians, Finns, and on and on. The lives of most of the population were utterly miserable. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom. Their lives did not change much, though, but at least they were no longer virtual slaves. Other reforms came slowly, but the Tsar was assassinated in 1881. The next Tsar up, Alexander III, dashed hopes for further reform by the so-called No Dream speech, in which he halted any further reforms for any peoples except the ethnic Russians. Peter the Great's capital, St. Petersburg, Petrograd in Russian, was a city fit for an emperor, with beautiful canals and palaces. But the rest of the country was suffering. For decades, Russian cities were a furnace of reform, rebellion, violence, and revolutionary movements such as anarchism, Marxism, nihilism. Radicals were organizing. Reforms were too slow in coming. Corruption was everywhere. There was little technological advancement. In 1905, there was a bloody massacre. Hundreds were killed. Reforms were quickly made, including the establishment of a national parliament and expansion of the right to vote, but it was too little too late. In 1914, Russia was dragged into World War I, unprepared for war. In 1917, the Romanov dynasty was overthrown, the country was crumbling, and a temporary or provisional government was created amidst all the chaos. So many groups were contesting for authority. One of the smaller, but more violent groups were the Bolsheviks. The name means majority or large party in Russian, from the word bolshoi, an example of their cunning use of words and images to gain and keep power through violence. Their leader was Lenin, a master political tactician and propagandist. Vladimir Ulyanov was an ideological radical for decades, particularly after his brother was executed in a failed plot against the Tsar 30 years before. In a time of violence, fear, and starvation, Lenin's iron discipline held fast against all opponents. One of his party's slogans was peace, bread, and land. And when people are starving and fearful, that's the kind of slogan that would appeal to them greatly. In October 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks successfully overthrew the provisional government and took power in Russia. Lenin was a violent revolutionary fanatic and imposed a violent revolutionary fanatical government on the long beleaguered Russian people. Before any other world leader, Lenin had a precocious and sophisticated understanding of the power of mass communications. He and his communist forces moved immediately to control all forms of communications. Radio was critical in a country mostly illiterate. Loudspeakers were installed in public halls, even outdoors, anywhere people would gather, to pump non-stop information and propaganda. Russia was now a one-party state, and all daily life revolved around politics, communist politics. Russia was involved in a bloody civil war from 1917 to 1923. In 1922, Lenin declared Russia a new name, the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Meanwhile, Lenin had plans for the rest of the world. He started up Radio Moscow, the official government propaganda arm, not just for domestic use, but for international propaganda as well, via shortwave radio. Radio Moscow was in the front lines of communist propaganda until the last days of the regime in 1991. The Soviets developed an insidious technique known to this day as agitprop, agitation propaganda. It is a form of instigating trouble and then capitalizing on it. It is an effective technique used today around the world to get attention and get on the offensive in a fight, especially a public one. The Soviets loaded up trains and sent them to the far reaches of the country. On board were newspapers, pamphlets, posters, and even printing presses to update their propaganda. Loudspeakers were set up at the stations to broadcast speeches. In a nation starved for information, even this obvious propaganda was news. Use of media in the Soviet Union was based on classic communist Marxist principles: confrontation, class envy, and totalitarianism. The propaganda was everywhere. It was overwhelming. It was efficient. It permeated not only news and politics, but everyday life as well. Academics were ordered to toe the party line. Science bent its knee to the one-party state. Thousands of people, in the 1920s estimated to be 70,000, were employed by the state to churn out misinformation and the party line on every subject. And deviating from that party line was a crime, punished severely. In fact, the phrase political correctness comes from this time and place. One's opinions had to be politically correct, that is, in line with party ideology, or else you were in danger. Falsification and terror were the order of the day. History was rewritten. There was no opposing authority or opposing opinion. There was no competition in business, politics, school, or in thought. People literally disappeared. Children were indoctrinated. The new so-called Soviet man was idealized. Children were taught to turn on their parents for treason. Lenin was called Uncle Lenin. When Lenin died of a stroke in 1923, the mystery was who would succeed him and what would life now be in this post-revolutionary Soviet Union. Lenin's successor was his untrusted henchman and lieutenant Joseph Stalin. Like Lenin, he was a violent radical who as a young man changed his name to hide from the Tsar's police. The name Stalin means steel, so Stalin portrayed himself as a man of steel. He was not an ethnic Russian. He was an ethnic Georgian from South Russia, which likely deepened his paranoia. Russians lived through decades of terror, purges, secret trials, work camps called gulags in Siberia, and murder. Military officers were purged in the 1930s, which nearly resulted in Russia losing World War II. Stalin ramped up the police state mentality with his KGB, the secret police. The entire country was one big jail. One thing we see in totalitarian states is that the names used often mean the opposite of their words. The official newspaper of the Soviet state, Pravda, literally in Russian means truth. But the only thing it was good for was to take the temperature of the one party state from the outside. Depending upon how they reported a story, well, we knew it was false, but we could tell from how the story was reported how false the story really was. While the propaganda trains still ran, they were too slow. Stalin had a propaganda plane built, the Maxim Gorky, with all the usual print propaganda, but also a radio transmitter called the Voice from the Sky. It had a photography lab and other modern communications equipment. While on a demonstration flight, however, the Gorky collided with a following plane and it never flew again. One of the oldest forms of propaganda is photodoctoring, a primitive form of Photoshop, if you will. In the top slide, we see an aide to Lenin just over his right shoulder. In the bottom photo, he is no more. Likely that the man's image was removed by Stalin in later years for reasons of politics or jealousy. These early deletions were primitive, but even that primitiveness sent a message. The message is, it is obvious what we did to Trotsky, and he was a big shot, he was close to Lenin, so we can easily do the same thing to you too. Very chilling. Along with the many images of the new Soviet citizen, Stalin created a cult of personality around himself. This humanized his image among the unknowing public. In the 1930s, Stalin forced the peasant economy to convert to heavy industry. Unfortunately for them, economic decisions were not made by free market individuals, but by politicians in the Communist Party, which meant that politics, not common sense, prevailed. It's like the old joke. A man from the government capital in Russia visits a tractor factory. He sees all the workers lounging around doing nothing. "What's going on here?" he roars. The workers reply, "You pretend to pay us, we pretend to work." Dissidents, political opponents, and often just people caught in the political crossfire were jailed or sent into internal exile in Siberia. Grim work camps from which few ever returned. In the end, the Soviet Union was a calamity upon the Russian people and all who came in contact with it. I made a business trip there in the 1980s, and it was like being in a third world country, not a nuclear power. We stayed in the second or third best hotel in the country, and it was worse than any hotel or motel I've ever stayed in here. The sink had no stopper. They supplied you with a little rubber stub you had to jam into the sink. The bath towels were as absorbent as paper towels. I'm glad I brought my own soap. The blankets were threadbare. The gourmet meals were next to inedible. Every meal, every piece of dark, grizzled something that was quivering on the plate brought the same response from the waiter. "Is beefsteak," he'd said. "It's beefsteak." "Sorry, Ivan, I don't know what that is, but it ain't steak." In our next chapter, posted later this week, we will look at the films of one of the greatest early film directors, Sergei Eisenstein. So stay tuned.